Have you ever wondered why certain pains never go away, or why you repeat the same patterns, even knowing they're going to hurt? The truth is deeper than it seems. Pain shapes the shadow, and behind many behaviors, there's an invisible emotional trauma, an unconscious pain that dictates your choices, your relationships, even who you believe you are. But there's something behind all of this that no one told you, and in this video you're going to find out. Get ready. What you're about to hear might just turn the key to your consciousness. Suffering isn't weakness, it's psychological heritage. Some pains don't scream. They whisper in the silence of nights, hide in distant stares, disguise themselves in automatic smiles. Most people believe that suffering is synonymous with weakness. But the truth is different. Suffering is a deep mark on the soul, a mark left by experiences that shape the psyche, building what Jung called the shadow. It's there, in the parts we avoid seeing, where unconscious pain hides what was repressed, denied, forgotten. All of it remains alive, influencing decisions, reactions, and relationships. We carry emotional traumas that we can't always name. They're fragments from childhood, gestures that weren't welcomed, words that wounded, and absences that hurt more than any presence. Jung's shadow isn't a distant concept, it's practical, every day. It appears when you explode without understanding. Why? When you sabotage an opportunity, or when you shut down in front of someone who wants to love you. This doesn't happen because you're difficult. It happens because there are childhood wounds that were never healed, only buried in the unconscious. This emotional armor that many wear doesn't come from nowhere. It's the result of a lifetime trying to survive invisible pain. And the more we deny what we feel, the more these pains become destiny, as Jung would say. This is the trap of depth psychology. What isn't resolved repeats itself. Those who have suffered too much without realizing it end up developing self-sabotaging behaviors shaped by the need for protection. But not all protection is liberating. And that's where the next point comes in. What, in fact, is this shadow that everyone carries and almost no one knows? What is the shadow? According to Jung, the shadow isn't a monster. It's not just the dark side in the moral sense of the word. According to Jung, the shadow is everything that was rejected in us. Not only what is ugly, but also what is powerful. Courage, creativity, freedom. All of this might have been suffocated in the name of acceptance, and that's why many don't recognize themselves. The soul keeps narrowing, trying to fit into labels, expectations, patterns. But what wasn't lived demands space from within. This shadow of Jung expands in moments of intense pain. When suffering is too strong, the unconscious builds layers of protection. We create masks to survive, forced smiles, controlling behaviors, calculated silences. All of this seems to work, but there is a cost. We lose spontaneity, and along with it, we lose vital parts of who we are. The shadow becomes a locked vault, full of pieces that could make us whole, but that were classified as too dangerous to exist. And there lies the paradox. By denying pain, we also deny power. Many self-sabotaging behaviors are born from this. Repression, procrastinating, exploding over nothing, giving up at the last second. Unconscious pain infiltrates these patterns and traps us in cycles. Those who live defensively end up getting used to half measures. And living by halves isn't living. But if the shadow holds what we were forced to repress, maybe it's time to ask, what exactly gave rise to all this pain? The origin of pain, trauma and rejection behind every rigid behavior, there's a story that no one told. It's not just about moments of pain, but about what those moments caused in the soul. Emotional trauma doesn't scream, it whispers backstage. In the mind, a look of rejection in childhood, emotional absence from those who should have protected, harsh words that seemed small but wounded deeply. All of this shapes the unconscious and begins to build silent defenses, almost always invisible. but devastating, and make no mistake, these defenses become identity. The person doesn't feel wounded, they believe themselves inadequate. And this belief infiltrates everything: relationships, work, the most intimate choices. Unconscious pain begins to direct life without being seen. The child who was ignored becomes the adult who shuts down. Those who were exposed to humiliation grow up hyper-alert, expecting the next attack. Fear of rejection transforms into a need for control, and spontaneity dies a little more with each attempt to seem strong. These traumas become seeds of Jung's shadow. They're the childhood wounds that gave rise to the self-sabotaging behaviors you repeat today. And what's most curious is that often these people are admired for their strength. But no one sees the price they pay for it. They live in emotional survival mode and don't even realize they're wearing emotional armor, so thick they can barely feel the world outside. But what happens when this shielding becomes permanent? People who suffered too much shield themselves. Those who were wounded too much learn quickly. Feeling is dangerous. So, without realizing it, they begin to shield themselves. The gaze becomes harder, the tone of voice firmer, the body more closed. It's as if the unconscious said, "We're not going through that again." And so, the heart goes into hiding behind a shield. This emotional armor, built to protect, also isolates. And when love tries to enter, it runs into the same walls erected to avoid pain. Independence becomes disguised isolation. The courage to not depend on anyone hides the deep fear of depending and being abandoned again. The person becomes an expert at not showing what they feel, because at some point, feeling was a reason for shame or punishment. And this pattern repeats itself silently. They say everything's fine, that they prefer to be alone, that they don't need help, but inside, the soul screams for embrace. Only no one hears because no one sees. This isn't weakness, it's survival. A mechanism that was born when pain was unbearable. But when this mechanism becomes permanent, it becomes a prison. What was defense becomes self-sabotage, and what was protection becomes chronic distancing from real life. Superficial relationships, cold connections, emotional detachment. All of this seems to be choice, but it's actually disguised fear. And this fear, when not recognized, continues to disguise itself, now as coldness. Hardness is a reflection of fragility. The person seems hard, cold, inaccessible, but this shell is just that, shell. Behind it, there's someone who felt so much they had to freeze so they wouldn't crumble. Unconscious pain is sneaky. It doesn't warn when it arrives. It just begins to silence emotions, block feelings, interrupt the connection with one's own body. And this emotional anesthesia becomes the new normal. Those looking from the outside see strength. But inside, there's contained desperation, begging not to have to feel everything again. This hardness, which many confuse with strength, is an escape. Jung's shadow strengthens when we can no longer access our humanity. When fear of reliving old childhood wounds paralyzes any attempt at affection. So affection becomes a threat, vulnerability, danger, and sincere laughter, a distant memory. People like this learn to function but stop living. They do what they need to, but on autopilot. There's no space for surrender, only for defense. And all of this seems like self-control. But it's fear, disguised as power. In many cases, this coldness comes from a specific episode: emotional abuse, brutal betrayal, a childhood where affection was scarce. And the mind, in a desperate attempt to protect, decided not to feel anymore. Depth psychology shows us that this freezing isn't weakness, it's a symptom. And while this symptom isn't understood, the cycle repeats. The person will relate without surrendering, will work without fulfilling themselves, will smile without feeling joy. But what if this hardness is, in fact, the cry of an unrecognized fragility? Anger as a psychic shield. Anger is fire, but often it's not just that. Behind it, there's an ocean of unspoken emotions. Anger protects. It rises like a shield when the soul feels it's going to crumble. People who went through deep emotional trauma learn early that crying is weakness, that asking is dangerous, that showing yourself is an invitation to abandonment. So unconsciously, they choose another path, that of anger, because it's loud. It intimidates, it pushes away, and what pushes away protects. But anger, when constant, isn't strength, it's prison. An emotional jail disguised as attitude. It prevents the person from listening, connecting, relaxing. Because feeling tenderness requires disarming, and disarming for those with poorly healed childhood wounds seems like an invitation to collapse. In some, this anger becomes explosion. In others, it becomes loaded silence. But the content is the same: unconscious pain dammed up, accumulated, suffocated. Jung's shadow feeds on exactly this. Emotions banished, rejected, swallowed dry. In many cases, anger is the only emotion that remained accessible, and the psyche, in its effort to maintain sanity, uses it as the only possible language. A simple example: people who lose their heads in trivial situations, but who held everything that really mattered for years. They're not just angry with the present, they're exhaling the past. And while this isn't seen, they'll continue building relationships based on tension, not trust. But is there another path besides the shield? Perfectionism and the fear of being judged. Perfectionism, at first glance, seems like virtue, but looking closer, it reveals something much deeper. Fear. Fear of making mistakes, of being rejected, of being insufficient. Those who grew up hearing constant criticism or had to earn love learn that they'll only be accepted if they're flawless. This pattern, rooted in childhood wounds, transforms into emotional armor. It's not vanity, it's survival. It's the attempt to avoid at any cost an unconscious pain that was once unbearable. Behind perfectionism lies emotional trauma disguised as high performance. Jung's shadow reveals itself here in the form of silent demand. If I make a mistake, I don't deserve to be loved. Depth psychology understands that this isn't just a matter of personality, but of identity built under pressure. And the worst part? Even when they do everything right, these people continue feeling indebted to the world because the demand doesn't come from outside, it comes from within. It comes from the shadow, which refuses to let the wounded child rest. Examples of this are everywhere. Someone who spends hours reviewing a simple email, afraid of seeming stupid. Or that person who never allows themselves to rest because they haven't done enough yet. This behavior seems like productivity, but it's just a sophisticated disguise for fear. The person isn't trying to impress, they're trying to avoid abandonment. But what happens when not even perfection is enough? What happens when even getting everything right? The internal feeling is still that something's missing. The collective shadow and the normalization of pain. We live in a society that transformed suffering into routine. Those who suffer too much are seen as weak, dramatic, or lazy. The discourse is always the same: get up and go. Swallow your tears? Everyone suffers, but this collective hardness only reinforces Jung's shadow on a social scale. Unconscious pain, which should be embraced, is pushed to the depths, and what isn't processed transforms into self-sabotaging behaviors, both individual and collective. The world at this pace keeps getting sick in silence. This emotional repression became culture. A cult of performance where feeling became a luxury. People are taught to disguise sadness with smiles, to ignore exhaustion with coffee, and to replace therapy with productivity. But pain doesn't disappear. It infiltrates in small intolerances, in explosions of anger, in cold and distant relationships. This collective shadow, fed every day, normalizes poorly resolved childhood wounds and perpetuates cycles of pain. Those who feel differently stay silent. Those who scream are silenced. And if we observe closely, we notice that this collective pain is reflected in the news, on social media, in everyday conversations. People attacking each other, judging without knowing, competing to see who can endure more. This isn't strength. It's a symptom. Depth psychology shows us that when an entire society represses emotions, it becomes hostile to its own humanity. But what if all of this isn't normal? What if we're just mirroring, en masse, a pain that refuses to be heard? The danger of identifying with pain. There's something silent that happens to those who suffered too much. Pain becomes identity. Gradually, the person stops seeing themselves as someone who lived through a difficult experience and begins to see themselves as the pain itself. This shapes everything: choices, relationships, dreams. It's as if suffering were dark glasses glued to the eyes, and even when the sun appears, vision remains blurred. Jung's shadow infiltrates this point with force. The more pain is repressed, the more it dominates the backstage of the psyche. Unhealed, emotional trauma transforms the inner world into an invisible prison. And what seems like resistance is often just disguised fear. Fear of letting pain go, because it became company. Emotional armor so old it's already confused with one's own skin. When someone begins sabotaging relationships or refusing opportunities, without apparent reason, that's where the truth lies. The unconscious mind believes happiness is a threat. After all, the wound still dictates the rules. Look, for example, at those who always think something will go wrong when everything's going well, or those who live ending relationships for fear of being abandoned first. These self-sabotaging behaviors don't come from nowhere. They have deep roots. Unconscious pain created internal narratives that repeat like mantras. And while the person identifies with these stories, inner transformation doesn't begin. But is it possible to break out of this cycle without denying everything that's already been lived? Healing begins with awareness. Nothing changes while it remains hidden. Jung stated that everything that doesn't become conscious transforms into destiny. And that's exactly what happens with unconscious pain. It infiltrates daily life, disguises itself as choice, and begins to govern everything in silence. Jung's shadow isn't a monster to be fought, but a part of the psyche that needs to be seen. When you look your own pain in the face, you begin to weaken the power it has over your life. Depth psychology shows us that healing never begins from the outside. It's not by changing cities, partners, or jobs that things truly get resolved. Inner transformation is born when someone decides to investigate what they feel, why they feel it, and what's behind it all. It's like turning on a flashlight in a dark basement that's been locked for years. The shock comes first, but right after comes clarity. And clarity is the beginning of freedom. Imagine a person who realizes they always sabotage themselves when they're close to achieving something important. Instead of judging themselves, they begin to ask, where does this pattern come from? What wound is this trying to protect? This type of question doesn't solve everything immediately, but it opens the door, and once opened, it doesn't close so easily. It's at this point that you begin to get off autopilot, and the true path of individuation begins. But how do you transform this awareness into action? From survival to full living, surviving was necessary. There were moments when the only possible option was to resist, close your heart, swallow your tears, and move forward. But now the question remains, and living, when does that begin? Unconscious. Pain taught you to protect yourself. Emotional armor was useful for a while, but today it weighs heavy. Jung's shadow continues operating backstage as long as you don't recognize that this pain no longer needs to decide for you. Inner transformation doesn't mean forgetting what happened, but giving new meaning to the past. When someone begins to accept their childhood wounds as parts of what made them who they are, and not as a life sentence, the process of individuation truly begins. And at this point, everything changes. Relationships gain authenticity, fear loses ground, and even anger begins to be recognized as a messenger, not as a threat. Living fully is having the courage to take off the armor. For example, someone who was always too strong, who never asked for help, begins to allow others to see their vulnerability. This is an act of real strength, not weakness. Or someone who always feared exposure begins to express themselves with more truth. It's like coming out of a basement and seeing the world with new eyes. But if suffering doesn't define us, then what really does define us? The truth about suffering is a rite of passage, even when no one chose to go through it. It destroys illusions, tears off masks, and reveals what exists most raw within the soul. But this isn't the end, it's the beginning. It's as if pain had the function of breaking old structures so that a new way of being can emerge. Jung's shadow, at this point, reveals itself as a map of what was lost in us. And on this map, there are hidden treasures. Depth psychology calls this individuation, the process of becoming whole. It's not about becoming another person, but integrating everything we already are, light and shadow, strength and fragility, past and future. What was denied begins to be embraced. Self-sabotaging behaviors start losing strength because unconscious pain stops being a hidden enemy. It becomes a guide, not a gentle guide, but a true guide, those who suffer too much. Learn that pain shapes the shadow, but only consciousness shapes healing. And healing isn't perfection, it's freedom. It's stopping living as a reaction to what hurt you and starting to live as a creation of what you desire. And this isn't easy, but it's also not impossible. Suffering can be the end of many things, but it can also be the portal to everything that's yet to come. The time has come to think, what are you going to do with all of this? The unconscious pain that shapes your shadow doesn't have to be a sentence forever. Have you stopped to reflect on which self-sabotaging behaviors you maintain, even without realizing it? Now that you have this knowledge, how about starting to question what holds you back? Inner transformation begins when you decide to no longer be a hostage to the past, but the protagonist of your own destiny. Are you willing to face your childhood wounds without fear, to finally live with more freedom? Imagine what your life would be like if this emotional armor were relaxed, allowing you to truly connect, to feel without fear, to surrender to the healing process. What if the emotional trauma that seemed impossible to overcome began to transform into strength? It's not just theory, it's something you can start practicing right now with small steps, whether by seeking reading like Jung's Man and His Symbols, therapy, or even the simple courage to look within. So, what will your next step be? If this video moved you, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next deep reflections on depth psychology and individuation. Leave your comment. What was the biggest shadow you've ever recognized in yourself? And don't leave yet. Click on the video that will appear on the screen to continue this journey of self-knowledge and transformation. Pain can shape the shadow, but consciousness can shape healing. Are you ready for this challenge?